Hello everyone, my name is Colin. Welcome to my crash course on the Company of Heroes 3 map editor. I am an Unreal Engine environment artist. You can find some of my pieces on this very YouTube channel. On the Steam workshop I go by ARMS, so you can check out some of my maps over there. I've been using the map editor for a couple of months now and have gotten a couple comments asking for a tutorial, so I thought I'd just jump right in and make a full course instead. The general structure of the video is the following. We are going to start the course by going over a relic-made map and sort of reverse engineering it, examining the techniques and tools that were used to make it, as well as going over the general map editor layout and tools. Then we will move on and create a bare-bones playable map from scratch, setting up all the essentials to get it working. Lastly, we will create a small, playable diorama-style map that will allow us to dive deeper into the various map editor tools and techniques. The goal of the course is to set you up with a solid foundation of knowledge that will allow you to start working on your own Company of Hero 3 maps. Now, without wasting any time, shall we begin? Alright, so we are starting the course. Of course, the first step is to find and open the map editor. You can do that by going to your Steam and navigating up to this top left button up here next to View. Click on that, go to Settings, navigate down to Storage, go to your whichever drive has your Company of Heroes 3 on it. For me that would be my main drive or my D drive. And you can see all the games I have on here, including Company of Heroes 3. Navigate up to this triple dot menu, click on that, and here you'll see the Browse Folder option. Click on that, you can close this now, and if we look in here, we are under our library, Steam Apps, and then we go to Common, Company of Heroes 3, scroll down, and here you will see the Essence Editor application. And you want to make sure it's the application you're clicking on. Find that, double click it, and here we have the Company of Heroes 3 Essence Editor. Now that we know where to find the Essence Editor and how to open it, let's begin the first part of our course, which would be going over an example map, which has already been made by Relic. So, to create a new map, we're going to go to create a new mod. Then we're going to do scenario, a handcrafted map. Scenario name, this is where you can put in the base name for your map. Your display name will be what shows up when you actually play the game. This scenario name is more for organization purposes. So we'll just call this example with the display name example. Instead of creating a empty handcrafted scenario, we're going to create a scenario from a template. And for this one, we're just going to do, or actually, let's do Road to Tunis. So click on Road to Tunis, have this all set up, then hit next. For the mod description, we'll just type in something simple, bloop. Location, this is where your mod is going to be saved. I have a dedicated folder for my mod, so I'm going to put this in there. Alright, and we are good to go. Let's create this map. And when you first load in, your screen will be all sorts of weird. So just go ahead and drag this bar over, and then drag this bar over to around here. Now we have a better view of our map here. Alrighty, now that we are inside of our example map, I'm going to start by just explaining how to navigate. So the controls are very similar to how they are in the actual game. You can hold down middle mouse button to pan around, scroll to zoom. Unlike in the game, there's no zoom limit. You can hold Alt to turn around, rotate, I guess. You can also click on things by hovering your mouse over them and left clicking. This will bring up the gizmo for moving, which you can use by either clicking on the red arrow, or you can click on the blue arrow to move it this way on the Z-axis, or on the red axis for the red arrow. You can click on this purple box here to just move it around. Now this move gizmo is activated with W on your keyboard. You can also hit E to go to the rotate gizmo, which will allow you to rotate your object. Or you can press R to go to your scaling, and you can scale your object. Now take note that if you scale something, it does not change its collision. So if you make a box very large, players will be able to run through this box right here on the corners because there's no actual collision there. It's still only registering what the collision was like before you rescaled it. So that is the basics of navigating the viewport. Moving on, the next thing we're going to take a look at is the left side scene assets browser. This browser right here, you'll notice it has these buttons up here, that's so you can tell it's the right one. This is where all of your objects and effects and textures and water, everything in your map is organized for you. So here you can see we have everything from buildings to blockers, which is for collision, cover, craters, foliage, FX, objects, splats, splines, which we'll get more into later. Everything's in here. So everything on this map is all inside of your scene asset browser. So if you're ever looking for something that you placed in the world, it will be in here somewhere. Now when you place an object, it will go to whatever folder you have set as the default parent. So if I was to, say, add a sandbag wall right here, it would go into whatever folder, whichever one of these folders, is marked as the default parent. And that can be confusing sometimes because you'll be working in an area and all of your objects will be in a different folder than what you expected. You can fix this by finding the folder, right-clicking on it, and doing set as default parent. This will make it so that anytime that you spawn an object, it will go into the correct folder. So I'll just do this really quickly. See, it's going to ask me when I first place it which folder I want to put it into. Let's say FX. So it's in our FX folder now, and it's set as our default parent. But we really want it to go into our foliage folder. So we can set this as our new default parent. And now if I add another tree, it'll automatically go into the right folder. Moving on, we can check out these tools up here and see that they say fog of war mode, ruler mode, terrain mode, go to symbol, and regenerate all, as well as all of these, which I've personally never used, so I'm not going to go over them. This first option is the fog of war mode, which will allow you to test what your fog of war will look like in game. There's the ruler mode, which allows you to, as you guessed, measure things between 2 points. Next we have the terrain mode, which I've never used personally. Go to symbol, I've never used that personally. Regenerate all, this is important. This button will regenerate all of your collision. So if you're noticing that maybe your troops are walking through something that they shouldn't be, you should try regenerating collision as well as rebuilding. Here in the Asset Explorer window, we can see all of the kind of underlying files that are being used in your map, like your prefab data, your actual scenario map. This is your mini-map file. Lots of other stuff that I'm not too familiar with. You may ask yourself, how do I place an object? So we're going to go over that right now. Down here at the bottom of the screen, you'll see this window down here. It might be on a different screen, but what you're looking for is the tab down here that says Object Browser. If you click on that, it'll take you to this screen. Just going to pull that up a bit. And here you can see all of the things that you can place in your level. All of the different assets and tools at your disposal. So let's begin by just adding a simple object. Go to EBPs, Environment, Objects, and let's just go to Defenses, Sandbags, and let's just put down some sandbags. You can place an object in the world from the object browser by right-clicking in the world, and it'll automatically snap to the terrain, and you can move it around now. And that's how most of this is made, is just putting objects in, using various different tools, and playing around with it. Now, after you've placed your object, you can of course manipulate it, but you can also duplicate it using Control-C to copy it, and Control-V, and it will spawn in the middle of your viewport. And you can move this one around now if you please. Or, alternatively, if you are doing something like maybe a hedgerow and you want to paste everything in a line, you can Control-C and Control-Shift-V instead of just a regular Control-V. And this will paste it in place, and then you can just move it to the side like so. Now when you're manipulating an object, you can of course manipulate it on the ground like this using the X and the Z, but you can also use the Y axis to move it up and down. So to access that, while you have your object selected, press H on your keyboard, and this will unlock the Y axis, and now you can move this around. This can be useful for a variety of things, maybe not so much for sandbags. And you can also navigate to the top right over here underneath Entity Blueprint, and you have a whole bunch of options here for how you want to be able to move around and place things in your world for this specific object. You have height lock, which is what we did when we pressed H. We unlocked the height, but you can lock it back to the terrain if you want, and it'll behave like it used to. Or you can do an offset lock, which I haven't personally messed around with, or the align lock, which I also haven't messed around with. And boom. The players will be able to use this and take cover behind it, and it'll be able to be destroyed and everything. It's all ready to go. A quick note with the object browser. Almost all of the objects that you're going to be using in your map are going to come from the EBPs section. So inside here with gameplay and environment, especially environment, this is where you're going to be getting most of your assets that you're going to be using. In the same folder, in the beginning, the templates folder, you also have an art folder. This has pretty much the exact same assets that you have in EBPs, as well as more. But as far as I'm aware of, none of these assets have collision. So if you place a sandbag in your level from the art folder and not the EBPs folder, your players will not be able to interact with that sandbag wall or whatever you placed. It is an art asset, it's not a gameplay asset. So make sure that when you're placing stuff in your level, if you want players to be able to navigate around it and use it, that you're getting it from the EBP section. You can also lock folders or actors when you're navigating through this bar. Say you really like the placement of these sandbag walls, and you really don't want to accidentally mess them up. You could lock them. This way, they will no longer be selectable, except for that one, because I didn't do that one. There we go. So now I can select all this stuff, but you're noticing there's no box surrounding these sandbags because they're locked, which can be useful for a variety of things. You can also hide actors or entire folders by clicking again on the locked icon, and this will cycle it into the hidden mode. So you can hide stuff if, say, you're wanting to work on the textures underneath this area, but you don't want to see the sandbag walls. You can just toggle that on or off. And moving on to the right side of the screen, here we have our properties window, which will tell us the properties of whatever object or whatever thing we have selected in the world. And we also have our transformation tab, where we can manually transform things like its z-axis. We can also use these buttons up here to help us manipulate our objects into the position that we desire them to be in. So we can transform things in world space, which is going to lock it on the world's Z and X axis, or we can move it on the parent space or the local space. I use local space almost all the time, and this will lock the gizmo you see here to the actual object's rotation, not the world's rotation. We also have these snapping options, so we can snap to the grid for placing things, or we can snap to rotations when we're rotating things, or turn it off if you need precise rotation. We also have the playback bar down here, which is the menu that allows you to play or stop your level, which basically just amounts to all of the animations that are present in it. So you can see smoke blowing and the trees are moving. And I usually work with the playback off, just to save on computing power. Next, I'm going to try my best to explain this toolbar up here. There are quite a lot of options, so I'll try and keep it brief. But here we go. So the first option, take screenshot. That's to take a screenshot of your environment. Haven't used graph before. I assume this is for viewing your statistics about how well your environment is running. Stats again, I assume that's something similar. Here you can access whether you want your grid to be XY, XZ, or YZ. I usually just leave it default, grid Z. Here we can see what we have selected as far as our map making tools. Right now we have no tools selected, so it says none. Here we have our audio region map, which allows you to basically select where you want your audio regions to be. I don't know if it's working. I personally haven't used it. We have our can't build map button here. Haven't used that before. Camera mesh. Haven't used that before. This might be for setting how high your camera can go in certain areas of the map. I'm not sure entirely. Cover map. I assume this shows you where all of your where all of your cover gameplay elements are added. So you can see in green where there's craters, because these are adding cover. Here you have your impasse map, where you can view collision. I almost never use this version of it. I almost always use this version over here of the impasse map. I believe these modes are just for viewing. Next we have our grid. Never use that. Yeah, I'm sure it's useful for something, but I never use it. Grid lines, again, probably just for organization purposes. Interactivity map, material map, metadata map, path map. This is for like navigation, so it's showing collision and places where vehicles can go. We also have our territory influence map, and this is where you can see all the individual strategic and victory points areas defined. And finally, we have our territory cell map, which, as far as I know, is just the same thing. Now, we're going to move on from the view modes. So we're going to click on None to get rid of this overlay. And now we're going to take a look at the actual, I don't know what they're called, but the actual tools you're going to be using to make your map. So here's deselect all. If you're doing anything in any one of these tools and you want to go back to just the regular mode, you can click on deselect all and you'll return to this mode right here where you can just select things and move them around. The next tab over is the height map. You're going to be using this one quite a bit. This is where you're going to be doing all of your sculpting of your terrain, so making things bigger and smaller and smoothing them over, etc. We will do a deep dive on this later. Moving on, we also have our audio region map, which I have never used personally, but I'm sure that you can use it if you do some digging. Next we have the select camera mesh option. Again, I don't think I've ever used this. The color map, this is for painting, just straight up color on your map. No textures, no fancy things going on, just literal color, which can be useful if you're trying to color match everything to the same color, but I don't use it very much. Moving on, we have the select grass map, and this is how you can paint in your foliage and grass, and you could select which kind you want over here. Again, in the right side of the screen, and they have a bunch of different foliage in this map. Maybe give that a try, painting some around. So that's the foliage tool. Next we have the impasse map. This is where you can see your collision as well as paint in places where you want to override your collision. So if we go up here to the top right, we can see what the collision looks like for the infantry, which you can see is just pretty small. Next we're going to take a look at the select interactivity map. This is where you can paint in where your map's boundaries are. So as you can see here in the example map, they've painted over here because they do not, even though this little corner of the map is technically playable, we don't want the player going there, and so they've painted over a impasse area. Next we have the select tiles mode, and this is for painting our map. So adding in more sand or dirt, whatever you want to do. Again, go over to the properties panel for the painter, and you can paint whatever you like in here. We will go over this tool in more detail later, but this is the basics of it. Left clicking in the world to paint, and you can find more options here. Next one is the select mega tile tool. I've personally never used this, but I'm sure you could find a use for it. The metadata map, again, I've never used this one personally. Snow depth map, I don't believe there is snow in the game right now, or at least I've never used this tool before. Might just be my own ignorance. Then we have the select territory map. This one's important. This is where you actually paint in your map's strategic point territories. And we will go into that in more depth later. And the next one over is the water flow map, which will allow you to drag your cursor in whichever way that your cursor is pointing. You can see on mine it's kind of pointing to the west. If I paint in this direction, the water will flow in the direction that it's pointing. Next we have the select water tiles map, and this is for actually selecting and painting what kind of water you want where. Next we have the blueprint list toolbar. This will just show you everything in your scene and how many of those objects you have in your scene. As you can see, we have quite a lot of African scree. 166 of these in here. So that's that tool. Here's the audio region templates. Again, I don't think I've ever used this. Group lists, never used that. Minimap, here you can see what your minimap's looking like. Object browser, which is already open by default. Palettes, I've never used that one personally, and you can toggle your atmospheric fog on or off as well. And that is the main toolbar. We will go into many of these in more depth in the future, but for now, I think a quick summary is a good way to go. And while we're still at the top of the screen, we'll go over these now. So under File, we have what you might expect. We can do new mod, open mod, recent files, recent mods. Here you can change mods quickly. Save as, if you want to be specific. Import, export as, all those. Edit, I almost never use this. This is just the basic stuff. Control Z to undo something. Control Shift Z to redo that thing. Under View, here we can bring up these different windows, so like the Assets Explorer and Render View. Take screenshot, debug, a whole bunch of other good stuff. Under Build, we have Build Mod and Clean Mod. I'm not entirely sure what Clean Mod does, but I know that Building Mod will build your mod and make it so that it's playable. It'll update everything so that you can play it. Burn is for cleaning up the assets and the code in your project. I've yet to use this. Wouldn't recommend it if you don't know what it does, but that's that. Attributes, this is more for coding stuff. I personally don't do much coding myself, so I don't mess around with that one too much. Reflect, same thing. This is for, I assume, optimization and more coding stuff. Same with localization. Scenario, this is a big one. This is where a lot of stuff is. So here you can view your, a lot of this is the same tools that you already have up here. So like the minimap tool, the toggle atmosphere fog button. So a lot of this stuff is already up here. We also have the option to resize our map. We will go into this in further detail later. We also have the generators option where you can, this is for when you're early in the process of creating a map, you can use this to, say, generate some cool eroded terrain, or maybe a sloping world if you're doing a map on a hill. Yeah, here you can switch your camera for different kinds of view modes so you can better position objects. And yeah, might want to take a look through the scenario tab. There's a lot of stuff in here. Script, this is for sure for coding and gameplay stuff. Tools, haven't used this one too much myself. Windows, you can reset your window layout if you say lose this and you don't know how to get it back. Help, I've never used that personally, but I assume it has something to do with emailing Relic about a problem. And that is the top row of the map editor. Now that we know where most everything is in the editor and where everything is located as far as assets and windows, I'm going to go over the major building blocks for building a map, your hammer and chisel, if you will. And those would be splines, splats, volumes, and EBPs. So starting with a spline, We can add one right here by going to Buildings, right-clicking on Buildings, going to Add, and we're going to add a spline. And it's going to add a line in the center of our screen in the world. So we'll click on that. There's our spline. And all a spline really is a collection of coordinates that are then having a line interpolated between those points. And you use a spline by placing things along those coordinates. And that could be anything from a road, like you see here. This is a spline with a road attached to it. It could be a blocker, like here. They have placed blockers around this rock to add collision. It could be walls. Yep, this fence here is just a spline with some fences placed on its coordinates. So one of the textbook examples of using a spline would be to add a strip to it, and this is how things like roads are made. So if we have our spline selected and we navigate to it in our window over here, you can right click on it, click add yet again, and we're going to add a strip component. Click OK. Now you can see we have our strip component underneath our spline. And if we navigate to our properties window over here, you can see blueprint, and this is what the texture is that you're going to assign to be placed on this spline. So we can navigate to something maybe like so now you can see we have our tank tracks in our world. They look terrible because they are not stretched out enough. So if we put the tiling up here to about 120, it's going to increase the, or actually it's going to decrease the size of the texture in the world so that it gets smaller and so that it, well, makes more sense. You can also change the width of your spline. Over here you can make them wider, although be careful with that with tracks because they don't look that big in the world, but once you play in game you will quickly notice that these are way too big to be humanly possible. So that is the strip component for the spline. It's basically just adding a texture along this point. Now with our spline we can also change its shape. We can do this by hitting spacebar with the spline selected, and it's pretty hard to see here, but there are little circles, and these circles are control points for your spline. So if you drag one of these, just select it, box select it, click dragging, you can then drag this out, and this is how roads are made. So I'm sure you can see how this goes. It's basically just manipulating these points to create the curve you want to make a road. And you can add more points by right-clicking anywhere in the world, just like how you would add an object. And you can add points like that, and because these coordinates are having a curved line interpolated between them, it'll all be smooth, so you can get these nice looking roads. Now with splines, they are not only limited to textures, you can also add objects and all sorts of things. So we'll go ahead and add an object to this spline. Again, click it, right click, add, and instead of a strip component, we're going to add a wall component. And you'll see we've added it and it's showing up over here. Make sure this is selected. We can go to right click and add yet again. This time we're going to add a entity, and this entity is the same thing as an EBP. So all of this stuff in here, you can not only, find it and click on it and add it, but you can also use splines to add things. So over here in this entity, we're going to click on that, navigate to the blueprint section, and now we can place all sorts of stuff along here. Let's just start with some sandbags maybe. So all we've done is just navigated through, just like we would our object browser, found an object we wanted, clicked on it, and just like with the road, these sandbags will curve to follow the curve that has been set by the spline. And the next building block for maps in the Essence editor would be splat maps. Splat maps are great. I use them all the time, and you will see they are all over the relic made maps as well. A splat map is basically just a texture that is being projected onto the terrain. And that's everything from these craters, which are literally just textures that are, again, projected onto a plane, to large areas like this that just adds a bit of variety to the ground, so it's not quite so boring. You can also use a similar tool called a decal, although decals are much more performance intensive, and it is highly recommended that you use mostly splats. Decals are okay if they're limited, but if you use too many of them, they will definitely bog down your scene. So to create a splat map, you can again find any folder, whichever folder you want. I'm just going to use buildings, and right click, add, and we're going to add a splat. And that will add this little thing over here. We can again navigate up to the properties panel, and let's put this scale up to something like 14 and 14. And let's find something to place. So we're going to click on the blueprint button. Go to maybe craters, or let's do FX craters, and let's just add a basic crater here. So as you can see, we've got a little crater here, and it was as simple as making a splat and adding a texture to it. Another pillar of creating maps with the editor are volumes, which are mostly used with collision, but you can also use them for gameplay elements like adding negative cover to areas or adding cover to areas. So if you go to EBPs, gameplay, blockers, we can spawn a movement blocker volume that's 6 by 6, and as you can see, this is basically just a box, and it's going to tell the game players cannot go through this area. And these are used everywhere, as you can see, all around the rocks, mostly just around the rocks, but there's a lot of them. So those are volumes. And the last building block that I want to talk about right now are the EBPs, which, as I've said earlier, are basically just objects in your world that can be interacted with by troops and players. So all of these sandbags, everything here that's 3D and an object is an EBP. You can add art assets if they're outside of your playable zone, but again, they do not have collision, so players will be able to walk right through them if you add them in your playable area. Yeah, EBPs are the core of your environment, as well as splines, splats, and volumes. Alright, and the next thing we're going to talk about is down in this section. Scroll down a bit and you'll find your atmosphere tab. Click on the drop down icon right here, and this is where all of your lighting is stored. So all of the lighting options for this map are here. For this relic made map, they have, looks like 5. I usually only do 1 lighting scenario for my map, but of course you can do more if you want. In here you have all of your settings, so we're on default test. And if you navigate over to the right side of the screen, you can find all the different settings for the atmosphere, including the sun orbit, which is the rotation of the sun, as well as the sun angle, so we can make it midday or sunset or nighttime, whatever. You can also affect the color and the ambient color. This is a big one. This will change the kind of color you see on objects where there's shadow. You'll see the effects most. So if we change this to maybe beach, you'll notice the tone completely changes because we've changed the ambient cube map, which is basically telling the render engine what kind of lighting there is around here. Because of course, there's nothing outside there, so this is kind of faking stuff being outside there. And it affects the scene pretty drastically. So play around with this a bit. And in this same tab, you have a lot more settings. I would go through this on your own and just kind of click through stuff, see what it does, experiment. You're in an example map, so if this map breaks for some weird reason, it's no big deal. So just experiment with stuff. Next, I just want to quickly talk about an issue with the map editor. When you create a new map, you will have no fog of war. So this tab up here will not do anything. From what I've seen on the internet, this is just a bug with the map editor, and the best way to fix it is to import a preset. But to import a preset, first you need to be able to export one. So we're going to do that right now. So you can navigate to any one of these. They all have it, the fog of war, but I'm just going to choose windy. I'm going to do save atmosphere presets, and then you can save this wherever you want. I just saved mine in my mods folder. And the next time that you create a scene and you have no fog of war, you're going to be annoyed. Just import an atmosphere that you have previously exported from a relic made map like this one, and that should give you fog of war. And once you have it in your map, you can tweak the settings to your liking. And finally, we're going to take a look at the main scenario window, which is going to store all of your details for your map. So the name, the description, the default camera angle, stuff like that. I wouldn't change a lot of this, like the blueprint. Definitely wouldn't change that, or scenario type. Stylized minimap, you want to definitely check this. I see a lot of people on the workshop that aren't using stylized minimaps, and honestly it looks bad, so make sure to use stylized minimaps. Just enable it by clicking the box there, and under pipeline path, I almost always do anvil secondary material. And the next time that you build your map, it will build your minimap, and it'll look much better than if you don't have a stylized minimap. That's the scenario window.